Welcome to the Cynthia Nyamai Show. Now we're still celebrating women. Are you celebrating the women in your life? Your sister, your friend, your mother, your wife, your cousin? Well, today the woman that we are celebrating is vulnerable to share about a time in her life that was so painful. It wasn't anything that she had done or planned. It was just the circumstances in her life. And it's easy when we're going through painful periods in our life to almost take a pause and want to wallow in that pain. But she soon found out that when we find purpose in that pain, it soon stops being painful. Coming up shortly. Lee Wanja was a straight-A student who was easily accepted to the prestigious Alliance Girls High School. However, in high school, her life took a different and unexpected turn, and a bumpy ride started through her early adulthood and her first marriage. In the pain, she found her purpose and started a new life. Today, she is the executive director of Imana Initiative, a humanitarian outreach, and she is also the lead pastor at Fortress Assembly, a church in Membli, Roiro. Thank you very much, Lee Wanja, for joining us today. Let me start with your childhood. Growing up in Kirinyaga, growing up as a pastor's child, both parents actually, and your dad a bishop. How was your childhood like?
Okay, thank you so much for having me today. I grew up in a very African home. Yes. It wasn't like overly spiritual. Yeah. We were not praying all the time. And I think it was just a typical African home. My parents were very stable, like it was a stable home emotionally. And we just grew up, attending church, of course, and that had a great influence on my life. But I feel like I was just like every other child.
Yes. You know, because for you that might have been normal, but I see a lot of pastors' children talking about they always had so many visitors.
We did. We did.
See, that was not normal in my house. They have to go for all church activities. You can't make any mistake because you're the pastor's child.
Yeah, and I have aunties everywhere and uncles everywhere that I'm not related to. Yes. Because they grew up in our house. Like I grew up seeing them in our house. So I have so many relatives that I'm not really related to. Yeah. And yes, there was judgment a bit. There was one of the, like a few of those statements that you shouldn't make this mistake, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do the other. But my parents tried to shield us from that. Yes. I think they could see how detrimental it could be. And so they tried to shield us.
Yeah. And when you're growing up, were you thinking, I want to be like my father and my mother and take the same career path?
No, being a pastor.
Yes.
No.
And you did.
I don't know who dreams like of being a pastor.
They see the benefits of being a pastor. Yeah. But growing up, you did very well in primary school, went to high school at Alliance Girls, and it all looked like it was going to be a very bright future for you. Yeah. But something happened in high school. Yeah. What happened? Okay,
so before I went to high school, I feel like I was very affirmed. Looking back, I feel like I was very affirmed as a child. The only thing that I distinctly remember is I was affirmed, especially because I was brilliant. Yes. And they would keep talking about how clever I was and all that. That was a big deal in our house. So I don't remember a lot of compliments around other things. Yes. And so I really defined myself around how well I did academically. So when I went to high school, it was a bit of a shock for me because I struggled with school a bit. And then I went into depression until
struggled
today.
Because you went in and found others who were doing so well, or were there some changes going on in your life?
I think there were changes going on in my life, but also I wasn't the star.
Yes.
We were all brilliant.
Yes,
We were
yeah.
all first in our
Yeah.
district. We were all
Because I hear a lot of children when they get to high school sharing that in their school they're always 1, they were the star. And then you get to the school of the best and you realize you're no longer the star.
Yeah, I specifically remember in primary school my compositions. I don't know if that happened to you guys, but like the first 3 compositions would be read in all the schools in the district.
Wow.
So that would always be me.
Yes.
So then I get into these auditions for journalism club. What I would do best was write, and then I didn't make the club. And for me, it was like, wait, this is a scam, you know? So that coupled with other changes that I was going through, I started to get depressed. And then I did not know that I was anxious about school. I didn't know that I was getting depressed. There was no information about mental health at that time. So that's how my life started taking a different turn. Yeah.
And do you think if someone had recognized it for what it was, it wouldn't have taken all those years?
I do, and I feel like because it got progressively worse, it started first by me slashing my wrists, and then it went up to me taking an overdose in Form 4 and waking up in a hospital. And I remember sitting with my principal, my dad was there, and my principal sat and very disturbed about what I had done. And I remember her looking at me and telling me, "You are a liability. You have to go home because you are a liability." And until today, I don't think I've ever said that out loud. I can't believe that she said that. Because for her, the risk of having me in school was what was bothering her. Not really that I was in trouble, that I could easily lose my life. She wasn't thinking about my family or my future. And that, for me to get over that, it took a really long time. Yeah.
And then, so you finished high school?
So I finished high school, and thankfully I was able to start working almost immediately. And I feel like I just started to come into a different experience with working. I feel like God distinguished me in my work. And while I was struggling in the area of personal joy, I was doing very well in whatever I was doing at work. And that really built me up. And that's how I began to heal.
Yes. And then did you begin to see yourself slowly understand what depression is all about after high school? When did you begin to understand what you were going through and what depression is all about?
Over 10 years after high school. Can you believe it? I did not even know that was depression. I thought I had a problem. I thought I was faulty. I thought that I was that I was formed with a problem, that I was born this way. I did not know that I was going through an illness. Yeah.
And in this 10 years, when did you now get married? Was it within the 10 years or?
Yes.
So you got into marriage without even really understanding some of the issues that you had.
And I feel like the problem with not addressing mental health, there are things that go quiet for years. There are things that go silent and dormant for a long time in someone's life, but they begin to shape how you see yourself. And you begin to see yourself through the eyes of other people and define yourself by how other people see you. So when people fall into the hands of people who are broken, and they themselves are broken, it becomes a total mess. So when I met my husband then, I don't think I had entirely dealt with what had been going on with me. I don't think I had come into a proper definition of who I was. So I was open to whatever definition I was going to be offered by whoever. And so I saw some signs that this was not going to go well, but I did not know that I could do better. I think now I look back and I'm like, oh God, I should have known.
I think one of the signs when you don't know yourself, then you don't know what kind of partner you actually need. And also sometimes it's when you still don't know yourself, then you don't love yourself, so you can't give people what you don't have. How did that project in your marriage?
So by this time I was already working in a church, And I think you would know that in our circles, the idea of marriage is very big. Like, and how to go about it. And everywhere we go, everywhere a single person goes, there is some sort of subliminal message that you need to get married. And if you're single, you're in delay.
Yes, and something is wrong.
And something is wrong. And we cast the spirit of delay. You know, like, it seems like there's something wrong if you're single. And so when I felt like it was time, I felt like I had met someone who I connected with. The only problem was that I think he was dealing with certain things which he hadn't dealt with by the time we met, and probably me too. And so when we got married, it became very emotionally abusive. And so it fell apart in slightly less than 2 years.
What were some of the signs that were there that could tell you this marriage from the start was not going to work?
I think the first sign was that we had a problem with conflict resolution. How we would resolve conflict was very dramatic. And I don't understand it now, because it doesn't make sense that a small issue would become such a big issue that would be drawn out for days. And so that was the first sign. But the second sign is that we had a difference in value. When we spoke, we sounded the same, we sounded alike, but the actions were very different. So how I would conduct myself and what I would say, and then how he would conduct himself versus what he would say, there was a huge disparity. But I only realized the fullness of it in marriage. Yeah.
So what happens when you grew up in the church, you were working at the church? They were feeling like, you're at the age when you should get married. There was that pressure. And then you go back and tell them, my marriage is not working out.
When we separated, I lost everybody. So first I had to stop working at the church. It was generally unacceptable to be separated or divorced. And then I lived in a very charged environment in regards to relationships. And so I had to leave, and no one followed, nobody bothered. And so that was just that. It's as if that was a totally different life. And that phase of my life was just closed. The only things that my parents were very supportive, which surprised me. I was terrified of telling them this is what has been happening. But I remember sitting down with my mother, and she was so shocked. And she said, you have to tell your father. And when I told him, he said, no, you have to stay away. And then we help you both while you're separated, and see if we can work things out. And so we did try to work things out, he and I. And we tried a few times. We got back together a few times. But then one day he decided that he wanted out. And by then I was expecting my baby. Yeah.
And you had to, even after that, it's like you had to start your life all over again. We're coming to that part of your life after the break. You do not want to miss it.
Until the point came when I was about to have my baby, and I moved back to Shags with my parents in the bed I grew up in.
Welcome back to the Cynthia Nyamai Show. Now, we took a break at a very juicy part. Your husband has said, I'm done. We've tried everything that we could do. You're pregnant. And I'm just thinking about, this is the young lady who in high school was trying to find out who she is. And she found out she's not the brightest girl. Still finding herself, tried to commit suicide, and even told that she's a liability, and then gets into marriage where most likely you were thinking you'd find your answers. The man walks away. You're left with a child. What next?
And you realize by now I was a pastor.
Yes.
I was already a pastor. And I was very angry, and I was very bitter.
Yes.
I was angry at God. because I felt like he had allowed this to happen and it was unfair. I felt like God was sadistic, and I felt like he had abandoned me when I really needed him to speak up for me, to defend me. And at that time, I didn't understand how human will works, that even when God has intended for something to happen, if a person chooses a different path, there's not much that you can do. And then I also didn't understand then the lies I had allowed to build up over the years in my life, starting with that one that I wasn't the brightest. Yes. That I had come into this place of accepting so many lies in my ears about myself. And so my pregnancy journey was tough. I was sickly the whole of that period. And as I was in my bed, I remember God just knocking gently at the door of my heart and telling me, let me show you that I love you. And I'd be like, no.
And that's the thing I'm wondering, would you allow him, especially after seeing the church abandon you at the time you needed him the most?
No. I really was not interested. And what's worse is I would feel like there's no running from him. You know, when the Bible says, even if you go to hell, even if I went to Hades, you are there. Yes. And I would feel like there's no running from God, and yet he had allowed these bad things to happen to me over and over and over again. So he told me only two things. Number one, let me show you that I love you. And the second thing he said, and that was very clear, is I want you to bring women together to pray. I was like, no.
Yeah. And before even that, because now you didn't have a job, how are you surviving? Where were you living? Because this is something a lot of times women go through in separation and divorce. You're almost left without anything and even financial support.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this was the first time in my life that I was going to come head to head with miraculous provision. When I left, there was nothing. I had nothing. I moved to a different town and had to start my life from scratch. God put together a contract for me the month after I left. I have just gotten a new place, and God put together a contract for me that enabled me to buy a car and enabled me to furnish a house and enabled me to start my life. The second thing that happened is a servant of God in this nation, a bishop, just reached out to me and asked, how are you doing? How can we pray with you? And then started to pay my rent. So this was my first time to come head to head with like the miraculous provision of God. And I think this is very important that I say for women. Cursed is the man who puts his trust on a man. The minute that you put your entire weight on a husband or a boyfriend or somebody to provide for you, that's when you have put your life under limitation. When I started to understand that God can send me help, and you know, I was angry, but I could see God doing things for me. He was doing what I didn't want him to do. I wanted him to heal my marriage, but he was paying my rent.
Yes.
But God paid my rent for a very long time, until the point came when I was about to have my baby, and I moved back to Shags with my parents in the bed I grew up in.
Wow.
And that's where I had my baby. Yeah.
So it felt like back to scratch, back to square one.
Yes. It felt like failure.
Wow.
Yeah, it did.
So having now to stay with your parents, probably under the same rules that you had, where you know you have to come home at a certain time. You had plans. You were in alliance. By then you're looking at your classmates. They have a totally different life.
Yeah.
How did it feel sitting in that room?
I mean, it really felt, it was very difficult for me. But I do feel like this was what saved my life, which is something else I'd like to say to anybody going through a separation. Some of the steps that look like you're being drawn back are actually you being drawn back on the arrow, as an arrow on the bow of God's hand. Because if an arrow is going to be shot forward, it has got to be drawn back. And sometimes when you retreat is a powerful battle strategy. And so I just went back and you know, the rules, I didn't even need them because I wouldn't get out of the house. I think the first thing that I had to do was admit that I had a narrative that was a lie in my mind about myself, and I began to just speak to myself a different narrative. So here I had been told that I wasn't as brilliant as I had thought. I wasn't this, I wasn't the other, I was a failure, I was this, and I began to speak to myself differently. Till today, I speak to myself with so much kindness. I speak to myself gently. I'm not harsh on myself. If I need rest, I rest. If I need to sleep, I sleep. If I need to just chill, I do. I don't motivate myself by being harsh towards myself. Just the same way I wouldn't speak a certain way to someone I respect, that's the same way I speak to myself. And when that narrative began to change from the word of God, I began to draw the truths about myself. I discovered that God rejoices over me with singing, Zephaniah 3:17, that God knew all of my weaknesses and all the things I had gone through, but yet he still rejoices over me with singing. And then I found so many beautiful things that God had spoken about me, and it began to turn my mind around. And that's how I was totally healed of depression.
Yes.
Yeah.
So till that time, until now, you've never suffered from depression?
Not at all.
And then that's when you started feeling like you have a calling or a feeling towards working more with women.
So I knew I had a calling all this time, but one day sitting in that bed in my parents' house, the bed I grew up in, God told me to start this WhatsApp group and teach people how to pray. So I put in about 30 ladies, my mother, my aunties. Remember my many relas?
Yes.
Like all the ones who cannot left the group. If they left, I would put them back.
Yes.
And I would say, do not left again. I said, we want to learn how to pray. And God has increased our online community so much, from 30 women just wanting to learn how to pray to an online community of almost 20,000 people praying together every single day.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you started a church later after that.
So yes, so the prayer ministry it has run for 6 years now. I cannot believe it. It has run for 6 years. And then about 2 years ago, I felt God leading me to start a church. And so that was like the harder part, in the sense that now that's when people pointed out that I'm single and I'm divorced and I'm a single mother.
Divorced, and then also you're a woman.
And I'm a woman.
Yes.
And a lot of people told me to wait until I get married. They'd say, you have to wait, you're going to scare off a man. You know, you can't do this now. It doesn't make sense. Just wait. And but God said this is the time. So I stepped up and did it. And that's how Fortress Assembly, an amazing church in Membley, was born.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then later on, you still found love. Because I checked out your Facebook page. I saw wedding photos.
Yeah.
How did you meet your husband?
We met on Facebook. So he saw me sharing my story and then dropped me a message telling me that he was appreciative of the message and everything. So the only thing that I would say is that when you're dating, when you would like to date a pastor, you have to be conservative. Like, you don't come full force.
Yes.
You have to be like very careful what you say, because we'll just be like, no, this one, no. So he was very respectful and restrained in conversation. And then he asked me out on a date, and we went out. And I remember going into the place, and my pastor friends were there. And I was like, oh my God. And so it was amazing. The chemistry was right. And he's a man who keeps his word, and he's a good man. So in a few months after that, we got married. So he's very respectful of what I have done with the ministry and who I am and my personality. But he's the leader.
Yes.
He's the leader. And so he just came in and blended very well with everybody. And it's clear that his leadership blends very well with mine. We have different personalities. He's a sanguine, very happy-go-lucky and excited. And I'm more detailed. He's more into the big picture. I know how to execute what he'd like us to do. We tend to agree a lot, and that has helped us be able to run the ministry together. Yes.
I think also what I'm really getting out of this is he understands your purpose.
Yes, he does.
And you were able to help him understand your purpose, because by the time you were meeting, you had understood your purpose. Yeah. And now we understand why purpose is very important. Sometimes we find our purpose in the most painful places in our lives where we have lost ourselves, and we come back to the things we have been called for, the reason why we are on earth. And it becomes easier to relate to people when you understand your purpose, have the right relationship, and even have the right career. See you next week.